Hello, Penyan, and welcome to the History of Comics Part 2 with me, Alex, your Penyan Public Library Adult Services librarian and comic book nerd. I don't know if anybody else cares about this as much as I do, but comic books are a uniquely American medium that I think it bears taking a look at the history of to see where we've been and where we could be going in terms of the possibilities of storytelling that comic books provide. So here we are on part 2, From Darkness to Silver Light, which is a title I made intentionally corny to sound like a Silver Age comic book title, as if you're familiar with the genre and the time period in question, it might sound somewhat familiar. So where do we leave off? Let's set the scene for a second. We're in the golden age of comics, that period between the 1930s and the 1950s when comics hit their apex, personified in stories and characters and comic titles like Superman, Batman, Captain America. Everything was very patriotic. It was the World War II era. Most of the superheroes that dominated comic books made their living punching Nazis, and everyone was happy. Everyone read comics. Comics were completely prevalent throughout the American culture. But World War II ended, and superhero comics started to wane in popularity. That sort of light and dark, black and white, very simple morality sort of storyline no longer quite entranced readers like it used to. And so other genres started to come to prominence as we got into the 1950s, notably crime and horror comics. So in this era, the noteworthy comic book publisher who stepped to the forefront ahead of DC, ahead of what was then known as Atlas, but we would know today as Marvel Comics, ahead of all of them was EC Comics. And they were very famous for stories, comics like Tales from the Crypt and other such horror and crime comics. A very big departure from the era of superhero comics just less than a decade earlier. These were macabre, these were morbid, these had visceral artwork that was a major draw for kids, certainly, but also that aging contingent of comics readers who were maybe U.S. servicemen during World War II and during the Korean War, who could stand a little bit more of the macabre. But unfortunately, these titles were not without their detractors. Those of us who work in libraries and who care about things like freedom of expression and the First Amendment and all that kind of good stuff know that not everybody might like these kinds of themes and topics and expressions of artwork that are unsettling and disturbing. But ideally, Americans have the right to create such things and have the right to read and view such things. Not everyone felt that way, particularly not in the 1950s. So we have a gentleman by the name of Frederic Wertham and his book, The Seduction of the Innocent. Now, Dr. Wertham was a respected psychiatrist who, as a primary concern, had as a primary concern the role of violent imagery in mass media. And now, I've grown up with Dr. Wertham as one of my personal villains, but I do have to do him credit. He was, both before and after this era, an important figure in American psychiatry for very good reasons. He served African American communities from the 1930s onward during an era when African American communities could not avail themselves very easily of psychiatric assistance, but Dr. Wertham believed that he should serve that population, and so he did. And in fact, on into the 1950s and 60s, when the civil rights era got into full swing, Dr. Wertham did offer his expertise in such things as the Brown versus the Board of Education case, which led to the desegregation of American schools. So Frederic Wertham, not all bad, but when it comes to media and comics in particular and First Amendment issues, not so great. His book, Seduction of the Innocent, posited that comics caused children to become juvenile delinquents. He called all comics crime comics, regardless of their genre or the stories depicted, which sort of shows a little bit of bias on his part right from the beginning. And his book documented supposed depictions of sex, violence, drug use, and other adult material in comics that he contended were aimed at children. Even more absurdly, he asserted things like the idea that artists hid imagery of female anatomy hidden around in things like depictions of muscle structure or tree bark, anywhere they could hide a little image for prurient interests he believed artists were doing all the time. He contended that Batman and Robin were gay lovers. And of course, there's two problems with that contention. The first is that they were not. And the second is that this presumes that a depiction of a gay relationship would be a bad thing. That was clearly Wertham's point of view on the matter. It would not be good for the children of America if comics depicted a healthy gay relationship. So two problems there. And he also contended that Wonder Woman's strength and independence made her a lesbian. Same idea. She wasn't, which is, its own thing. But B, the contention that simply depicting a lesbian in comics is bad. These are not these are not ideas that most of us would consider to be worthy of consideration these days. Of course, there are always some people who probably still wish that there were no gay characters in comics. I can tell you, jumping ahead a little bit here, that there are lots and lots of gay characters in comics now, and it is fantastic. So everybody can just deal with that. Getting back to Wertham, though, for such an educated and intelligent man, he did indulge in a pretty popular logical fallacy, this notion that correlation proves causation. In his research, he found that 95% of children in reform school read comics. Therefore, comics must have caused all of their delinquency. Correlation proving causation in Wertham's mind. Never mind that probably 95% of all kids in this era read comics. So where's your causation there? Popular comic book creator Stan Lee would say, Wertham said things that impressed the public, and it was like shouting fire in a theater, but there was little scientific validity to it. And yet, because he had the name Doctor, people took what he said seriously, and it started a whole crusade against comics. And indeed, there were even mass public burnings of comic books in the 1950s. Wertham had been speaking out about the issue of comics' effect on juvenile delinquency for some time, and even before the publication of his book, the American people had been taking note of his and others' claims. And in fact, there was an entire Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency in the 1950s that was established to investigate the supposed crisis of juvenile delinquency. And I think perhaps nothing better epitomizes the self-perpetuating mythologization of this squeakiest clean of decades than the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency and its focus on comics, which is the ultimate solution in search of a problem. Public hearings in 1954 concentrated on comics' role in promoting juvenile delinquency, and the publisher of EC Comics, the publishing company responsible for those Tales from the Crypt type comic books, William Gaines, was called to testify, and in the course of his testimony was confronted over the cover of a crime comic depicting a decapitated woman, sparking a back and forth with senators over what constituted, quote, good taste in the context of a publication whose purpose is, of course, to be dark and chilling. Senators were actually unaware that Gaines had already worked with the artist in question to considerably soften the image. So where the senators on this committee might contend that the people responsible for comics were just sort of willy-nilly letting anything go without any consideration for any kind of public good or good taste, it was already part of the industry. Artists produced work, writers created scripts, editors worked with them. If something went too far, it was pulled back. And there's also this notion inherent in this committee on juvenile delinquency that comics were all just kid stuff and intended for an audience of children, when certainly by this time in the 1950s, there were people who had grown up with comics, were in their adulthood still reading comics, and perhaps some of those Tales from the Crypt type stories were not intended for little Billy Johnson down the street, but maybe for grown men and women who could handle those kinds of things. But according to Wikipedia, though the committee's final report did not blame comics for crime, it recommended that the comics industry tone down its content voluntarily. Possibly taking this as a veiled threat of potential censorship, publishers developed the Comics Code Authority to censor their own content. The code banned not only violent images, but also entire words and concepts, such as terror or zombies, and dictated that criminals must always be punished. And this obviously destroyed most EC-style titles and left a sanitized subset of superhero comics as the chief remaining genre. It wasn't all superheroes, and in fact, the superhero genre continued to wane in popularity under the yoke of the Comics Code Authority. And if you've been a comics reader at any point in the past 30 years or so, this little icon here probably looks very familiar to you. It would appear on the cover of just about any comic you purchased from Marvel or DC or any of the other larger publishing houses. Comics publishers were, they voluntarily submitted themselves to this authority and limited the themes and the images that they could present for the next 50 or so years. So while superhero comics did continue to exist, they did continue to lose popularity, and by the late 50s, comics popularity was dominated by Westerns and romance titles. In fact, only 3 superheroes were published in their own titles by the end of the Golden Age: Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. All the big heroes that were super popular in the 1940s from Timely and Atlas Comics, which would become Marvel Comics, meaning Human Torch, Submariner, and especially Captain America, they were all gone. They could not sustain their popularity in this era. And EC canceled all of its horror titles and made the fateful decision to focus on a single humor magazine, which you may recognize, Mad Magazine, with that fascinating character on every cover. So that's how things stood at the end of the 1950s. Things were pretty dark, especially if you were a superhero comic book fan. There wasn't much to sink your teeth into. Comics were sanitized, you might almost say neutered. There was no dealing with ambiguous, complex moral issues. Some other consequences of this era: there was a disappearance for some time of strong female characters in mainstream comics. Obviously, LGBTQ plus characters were completely verboten. And any sort of questioning of authority was stifled. So here, by the end of the 1950s, you have comics submitting to sort of a perfect microcosm of what the 1950s aspired to be. But any action has an equal and opposite reaction, no matter how long it takes to be fully recognized as such. And with the sundowning of the Golden Age, the end of comics' complete and total domination of culture, there was a sliver of a silver lining, which would come to be known as the Silver Age. And there is some debate as to the start of the Silver Age, when this all began, but it's easier to look at certain milestones. Going all the way back to 1956, you see in a comic called Showcase number 4, the debut of the first superhero of the 1950s to debut new and actually find success, and that is a new version of The Flash from DC Comics. You can also look at the formation of the Justice League of America in DC Comics, which showed that all of these heroes that had been introduced over the next couple of years were popular enough to sustain a group comic starring them all together. And then you can look over at the revitalization of the former Timely and former Atlas comics as Marvel Comics with the publication of Fantastic Four #1. Publisher Martin Goodman saw the Justice League and said to a staff writer, hey, we've got to do something to match DC over there, the distinguished competition, as they would come to call them. What kind of superhero team can we put together? And that staff writer, who legend has it, was just days away from deciding to quit what he saw as the dead-end comics biz and try to pursue a life of writing novels. Was encouraged by his wife, who said, you know what, you're on your way out anyway. Why not just do a comic the way you want to do it? Give it a try, submit it. You haven't lost anything if it doesn't fly, but at least you tried something your way. And so he submitted the Fantastic Four with artist Jack Kirby, and it was a sensation. And that writer was Stan Lee, who had been in the business for a good 20 years already. And instead of leaving to become a novelist, he became the sort of the comic book hype man for most of the next 50 years. Another milestone you could look at in this era that I did not have room to put on this slide would be Amazing Fantasy number 15, which was the first appearance of Spider-Man. And Fantastic Four and Spider-Man both kind of epitomize the new approach that Marvel Comics brought to superheroes, where there was a little bit more humanity to them. Spider-Man was an average teenager who happened to be gifted with extraordinary powers, and the Fantastic Four was more like a bickering family than a elite fighting force. And so you started to see, even in these earliest days, a little bit of a dividing line between what DC was producing and what Marvel was producing. You could look at DC as having the sort of lock on the traditionalist view of comic books, square-jawed squares, if you will. There wasn't a whole lot of razzle-dazzle to characters like Superman or the Flash or Green Lantern in this era. And they were a little bit goofy in the vein of the Batman TV show, which would come out a few years later. And that TV show and the comics would influence each other for a number of years, but generally tending away from serious business and into a little bit more absurdity. On the other hand, Marvel really courted the counterculture with misfit characters, like the Thing from the Fantastic Four. That's that orange blocky fellow with his back to us in the cover there. The Hulk, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange. These characters were offbeat. They were not the typical, stand on an image of the globe with an American flag looking very noble kinds of guys. They were misunderstood. They were treated like villains. They didn't like their own lots in life, and yet they always found a way to do the right thing. So a little bit of a difference in style between Marvel and DC. Over the years, that would soften, but they really did sort of establish these house characters. The reintroduction of superheroes could be seen as the industry reacting to the imposition of the Comics Code, because here now was a reinterpretation of a genre that had previously been good only for socking Nazis in the jaw and good vanquishing evil at all times. These characters could be used for bold, colorful stories with little darkness or moral ambiguity, with good guys pursuing and punishing bad guys. But it's all in the details and the types of characters that the writers chose to create and tell stories about that allowed the Silver Age to pull away from that dark end of the Golden Age and become something a little bit more special. And we'll get more into that when we talk about the Silver Age in a future installment. I should also mention briefly that Stan Lee, as the editor-in-chief and primary writer at Marvel, introduced what has become known as the Marvel method, which ushered in an era of intense creative flourishing. And what this boiled down to was a greater collaboration between writer and artist than had been seen before. It kind of turned the comic book office into almost like a assembly line that could really churn out comics quickly. They weren't always the best products, but they were definitely creative. And it led to its own problems later on that we will again talk about when we delve more into the Silver Age. One final item to point out while we're talking about this transition from Golden to Silver Age, and we're on into the 60s, is another reaction to the Comics Code, which was underground comics, comics with an X. These were small press or self-published titles which allowed the creators to ignore the Comics Code authority and everything that implies. These comics were satirical, irreverent, and socially relevant, and they were free to depict graphic violence, sex, drug use, etc. Some of the prominent creators in the underground comics movement include Gilbert Shelton, Barbara Willie Mendez, Trina Robbins, the punk artist Gary Panter, and especially R. Crumb. And I want you to notice that there are actually female names on that list. For the first time since the Golden Age, there are a few creators who are of the female persuasion finding success, and it's not a surprise that that happened in the world of underground comics rather than in the mainstream comics. R. Crumb, as he is known, is sort of the granddaddy of the underground comic scene. He is still alive today. There was a documentary about him. I'm not sure if he's still working or not, but he's still out there. And his work is known both for its nostalgia towards American folk culture and its searing criticism of contemporary culture. And I will add that these underground comics, particularly those by R. Crumb, are not for the faint of heart. If you go looking for any of those, you will find graphic adult themes. And it makes sense because comics are a medium. Media are not all for one group of people and not for any others. There are comics that are for kids. There are comics that are for young adults. There are comics that are squarely for grown-ups. And this notion that comics are only for kids are really what led to the dark days of the Frederic Wertham era and the Senate hearings that made it seem like these things shouldn't exist for anybody because they're supposed to be for kids and they're horrible. Not for kids, always. They can be for adults too, and that is okay. And that's sort of the transition from the Golden Age to the Silver Age, and I think the next time we will cover the Silver Age and its transition into what's sort of oddly known as the Bronze Age, where a lot more developments took place. So stay tuned for a future segment in the history of comics from your pals at the Penn Yan Public Library and me, Alex. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.